In 1985, in south-central Los Angeles, a young woman was found shot and left in an alley, marking the beginning of a case that would quietly stretch across decades without a name attached to it. Over the years, more victims appeared in similar conditions, each crime carrying the same signature, but for a long time they were not fully connected as one continuous pattern. The women were targeted in the same neighborhoods, under similar circumstances, and yet the investigation never formed a complete picture strong enough to identify a single suspect. As time passed, the killings slowed, then seemed to stop entirely, creating the impression that whoever was responsible had disappeared without leaving a trace behind. By the early 2000s, forensic testing confirmed what had once been uncertain, that a single individual was responsible for multiple murders spanning years. The case was given a name, the Grim Sleeper, because of the long gap between the early crimes and the later ones that suddenly reappeared. Despite having DNA evidence that clearly belonged to the killer, investigators were unable to match it to anyone in existing databases. For years, the case remained in a strange state, not unsolved due to lack of evidence, but unsolved because the one piece needed to identify the person behind that DNA was missing. Then, in 2010, something changed, not at a crime scene, but through a method that had never been used in this way before. A discarded pizza slice, taken from someone who was never a suspect, would quietly lead investigators to the man they had been searching for all along. This is the story of how one overlooked detail connected decades of violence to a single identity, and finally closed a case that had been waiting for a name. In 1985, in south-central Los Angeles, 25-year-old Deborah Jackson was found shot and left in a narrow alley, her body partially concealed, marking the first known incident connected to what would later become a much larger case. She was last seen walking alone at night in a neighborhood where street activity was common, but her disappearance did not immediately trigger a large-scale search or urgent response. When her body was discovered, the scene suggested a controlled attack, with no immediate signs of struggle nearby, indicating she had been approached and subdued quickly. The location, a quiet alley between residential buildings, showed no witnesses coming forward and no clear timeline of how long she had been there before being found. At the time, the case was treated as an isolated homicide, with investigators focusing only on the immediate evidence present at the scene. Basic forensic work was conducted, including collection of biological evidence, but technology at the time limited how far that evidence could be used. There was no suspect identified, no immediate connection to other crimes, and no indication that this was part of a repeating pattern. The surrounding community, already dealing with frequent crime, absorbed the incident as another tragic but isolated event without wider recognition. What was not yet understood was that this moment would become the starting point of a pattern that would quietly continue for years without being fully connected. This was the last normal moment before a series of crimes began to form a pattern that no one could yet clearly see. As the months passed after the first killing in 1985, another woman was found in a similar condition, shot and left in a location that closely resembled the earlier scene, but still treated as a separate case. Like the first victim, she had been alone at night, moving through the same general area, and there were no witnesses who could clearly describe what had happened in the moments before her death. The positioning of the body, the absence of visible struggle, and the controlled nature of the attack began to suggest a pattern, but not one that was immediately confirmed. Investigators documented similarities, but without a clear suspect or strong forensic link, the cases remained isolated in official records. Over time, additional victims appeared, each case quietly adding to a growing list that had not yet been formally connected into a single investigation. The locations remained consistent: residential streets, alleys, and areas where visibility was low and movement at night was common but not closely monitored. The offender's approach appeared calculated, targeting individuals who were unlikely to be immediately reported missing or aggressively searched for. At this point, the pattern existed in fragments, visible only when cases were viewed together, but still separated in how they were investigated. There was no public recognition of a Syrian offender and no unified effort to track a single individual responsible for multiple crimes. This was the point of no return, where the pattern had already formed, but the understanding of it had not yet caught up. As more bodies were discovered over the late 1980s and early 1990s, the connection between the cases slowly began to emerge through repeated forensic patterns that could no longer be ignored. Each victim had been approached in a similar way, with no forced entry, no prolonged struggle, and evidence suggesting the attacker maintained control quickly and efficiently. Ballistics reports confirmed that the same type of firearm had been used in multiple cases, linking incidents that had previously been treated as unrelated. Biological evidence collected from different scenes began to point toward a single individual, even though the technology at the time could not yet identify who that person was. Despite these similarities, the response remained fragmented, with cases handled separately rather than as part of a coordinated investigation. The neighborhoods where the crimes occurred continued to see routine police activity, but nothing that reflected the scale of what was actually happening. Family members of victims reported concerns and similarities, but their observations did not immediately shift the direction of the investigation. At the scene of each discovery, the same pattern repeated: a body found, evidence collected, and then the case slowly losing momentum without a clear suspect. The lack of urgency allowed the pattern to continue, with long gaps between incidents making it harder to establish a continuous timeline. It looked like a series of isolated crimes, but beneath that surface, a single offender was already operating with consistency and control. As the pattern extended into the 1990s, investigators began forming an early working theory that the killings were connected, but the scope of that connection was still underestimated. The crimes were largely concentrated in the same areas, targeting women in similar circumstances, yet the cases were not given the coordinated attention required for a serial investigation. At the time, law enforcement resources were stretched, and many of these cases were deprioritized due to assumptions about lifestyle and risk factors associated with the victims. This early interpretation shaped how the evidence was handled, with each case being processed individually rather than as part of a larger system. Although biological evidence was collected from multiple scenes, it remained stored without a method to identify it belonged to. The lack of a suspect meant there was no reference point to compare that evidence against, leaving a critical piece of the case effectively unusable. Investigators built an initial narrative based on limited connections, but that narrative did not fully reflect the scale and consistency of the crimes. The killer, operating within the same environment, continued without interruption, taking advantage of the gaps in coordination and recognition. Subtle inconsistencies existed within the evidence, details that suggested a single offender moving through the same patterns, but they were not fully elevated at the time. What appeared to be a set of difficult but separate cases was actually a single story that had not yet been correctly understood. By the early 2000s, the pattern could no longer be ignored as advances in forensic testing confirmed that multiple cases were linked by the same DNA profile. What had once been a collection of separate investigations was now officially recognized as the work of a single offender operating over many years. A dedicated task force was formed, bringing together previously disconnected case files into one unified investigation for the first time. The timeline began to take shape, showing a series of killings in the 1980s, followed by a long gap and then a reappearance in the early 2000s. This gap became one of the most puzzling elements of the case, leading investigators to question whether the killer had stopped, moved, or simply gone undetected. Despite finally having a clear forensic link between the crimes, there was still no match in any existing criminal database. Every attempt to identify the DNA profile failed, leaving investigators with certainty about the crimes, but no identity behind them. The frustration grew as the evidence clearly pointed to a single individual who had managed to avoid detection for decades. Subtle details within the case continued to suggest that the answer existed somewhere outside traditional investigative methods. The case had reached a critical point where everything necessary to solve it was present, except the one detail that could connect the DNA to a name. By 2010, investigators introduced familial DNA searching, allowing them to look for partial matches to relatives of the unknown suspect instead of waiting for an exact match. The DNA collected from multiple crime scenes was reprocessed through this method, searching for individuals who shared enough genetic markers to indicate a family connection. A partial match was identified, linking the crime scene DNA to a younger male whose profile already existed in the system from a previous arrest. This match did not identify the killer directly, but it confirmed that the offender was a close biological relative of that individual. Investigators traced that connection and identified the young man's father, Lonnie Franklin Jr., as a potential source of the original DNA profile. They then compared known details, including age, location, and timeline, and found that he fit the period and geography of the crimes. This established a clear investigative direction, allowing surveillance to begin based on a defined biological link rather than an unknown suspect. Officers monitored his movements and waited for an opportunity to collect discarded material that could legally provide his DNA. During surveillance, he discarded a partially eaten pizza slice, which was recovered without his knowledge and submitted for testing. The DNA from that pizza slice matched exactly with the DNA collected from the crime scenes, confirming his identity as the source of the evidence. In July 2010, after the DNA match confirmed the identity, Lonnie Franklin Jr. was arrested at his home in South Central Los Angeles without incident. Search warrants executed at the residence revealed photographic evidence, weapons, and items that directly connected him to multiple victims across the timeline of the case. The investigation expanded rapidly, linking him to at least 10 murders and additional attempted murders that had previously remained unresolved. Each piece of stored forensic evidence, once limited by technology, now aligned with the identity that had finally been confirmed. The pattern that had existed for decades was reconstructed in full, showing consistent methods, locations, and victim profiles across the years. During the trial, the prosecution presented DNA evidence, ballistics, and photographic records that established a clear and continuous link between the crimes. He was convicted in 2016 on multiple counts of murder and attempted murder, formally closing one of the longest-running serial cases in Los Angeles history.
The case revealed how systemic gaps, delayed recognition, and limited coordination had allowed the crimes to continue for years without interruption. It also demonstrated how advances in forensic methods, particularly familial DNA searching, changed the outcome of investigations that once seemed unsolvable. What began in 1985 as an isolated case ended decades later with a single detail connecting everything, turning evidence into identity, and finally bringing closure to a pattern that had remained hidden in plain sight.